Admixture between Afro-Asiatic populations and Kura-Araxes populations. There is clear evidence that admixture occurred between Afro-Asiatic populations and the Kura-Araxes populations. And you see this admixture highest more so in the lands north of Arabia, such as the Levant and Iraq, this admixture. But first, let's briefly establish what these genomes are. What is an Afro-Asiatic genome and what is a Kura-Araxes genome? So genetically speaking, Afro-Asiatic populations would carry Natufian and Ibero-Mauritian ancestry, since it is these very populations that created and spoke some of the first Proto-Afro-Asiatic languages. Also, the Y DNA chromosome of Afro-Asiatic populations will belong to haplogroup E, giving the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family. It seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Ebalites and Akkadian early Semitic languages are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC, so Proto-Afro-Asiatic speakers, Natufians, basically. The Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Proto-Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. So Proto-Afro-Asiatic, they had E-P2, these populations. So like I said, Afro-Asiatic peoples, they typically have haplogroup E as their Y DNA chromosome, and they also typically have Ibero-Mauritian and Natufian ancestry. That is the Afro-Asiatic genome. Natufian ancestry, Ibero-Mauritian ancestry, Y chromosome, haplogroup E. It all overlaps each other perfectly. And these peoples, by the way, typically have a brown skin tone, black hair, dark eyes. Now, genetically speaking, Kura-Araxes populations would carry Zagros Iranian as well as Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry. Also, the Y DNA chromosome of Kura-Araxes populations would belong to haplogroup J. The Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 can be linked to the Armenian highlands and present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the Kura-Araxes culture. Three subclades of it, J1-ZS3042, J1-ZS5658, J1-ZS2872, and J1-Y5353, are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups, suggest Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the Kura-Araxes culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant as well. This supports the existence of the Alduin language family, linking Hurrian to Northeast Caucasian. So we see that Northeast Caucasian, Hurrian, Kura-Araxes, these peoples, their Y DNA chromosome would be haplogroup J. And when it comes to the autosomal breakdown of the Kura-Araxes culture, we'll be reading what's in yellow. Overall, the Caucasus ancestry profile falls along the Armenian and Iranian Chalcolithic individuals and is indistinguishable from other Kura-Araxes individuals, Armenian Early Bronze Age, on the PCA plot. So basically, the Caucasus ancestry, it's linked to Armenian and Iranian Chalcolithic DNA, as well as Armenian early Bronze Age DNA. So this is basically the distribution of Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, as well as Iranian Chalcolithic and Neolithic ancestry. And of course, Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry is highest in the Caucasus and expands throughout, going into the northern part of the Near East. Like I said, you're going to have a lot of this admixture in the northern part of Arabia up here. And also Iranian DNA goes all throughout the Middle East, but its highest distribution is in Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. And of course, all of this overlaps perfectly with Caucasian speakers as well as Indo-European populations. So returning back to our main question, there was clear admixture that occurred between Afro-Asiatic populations and Kura-Araxes populations, more so in lands north of Arabia, such as Iraq and the Levant and other close regions. This can be clearly seen by looking at genetic distribution maps of Natufian ancestry as well as Caucasus hunter-gatherer / Zagros Iranian ancestry. You can clearly see that there's an overlap. So, as an example, here is Natufian ancestry, like I showed earlier. It's in all areas of Afro-Asiatic speakers, and then here is the Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, and we can see that there is an overlap with Caucasus hunter-gatherers in places like the Levant, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and right here with the Natufian ancestry in the Levant, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Iraq. You can see basically that Natufians and Kura-Araxes people would have met each other within this area, and even really to a certain extent, even less so in Anatolia, the Southern Caucasus, and Iran. You can find some people with Natufian ancestry, but there's definitely genetic overlap in this general area of the world. And we even see it most definitely with the Iranian ancestry. We have, of course, Natufians all throughout the Middle East, but Iranians, ancient Iranians, also made their way into the Middle East, and their ancestry is seen even as far as North Africa. So there was definitely genetic overlap among Natufians and Iranians. And just to show you with other distribution maps, just to lay this point further, again, in the northern part, or really just from Syria and Iraq all the way to Arabia, you basically see that there was an overlap with Natufian ancestry and Iranian Neolithic people. These peoples would have admixed with one another. They're both in the same geographical area. We even see it in northern Africa. So there is going to be some genetic overlay, some genetic overlap between these people with Natufian ancestry and people with Iranian ancestry. Here again, it's just another example of that. Another distribution map with Natufian ancestry being mostly in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and then Iranian Chalcolithic ancestry also being in Syria, Iraq, the Jordan, and Israel. So there's some overlap that we have to keep in mind about. So, as I said, the highest amount of admixture or the most genetic overlap we see in the Middle East is north of the Arabian Peninsula in the Levant and Iraq. And this is why Middle Easterners / Semitic speakers in the Levant / Iraq today aren't good examples of Proto-Semitic peoples and are not genetically closest to the Natufians. Let me just show you. People in northern Arabia or countries north of the Arabian Peninsula, they're not good examples of the original Proto-Semitic genome because of this hardcore overlap that occurred in this area of Syria, the Levant, and Iraq. These people will be the most admixed with this foreign Iranian source, so they're not a good proxy for the Proto-Semitic genome as of today in the modern era. Perhaps more in the past. Of course, these populations would have had more Natufian ancestry, but because of this Iranian influence, they're not a good proxy for the Proto-Semitic genome. Isolated populations would be a better source. Even in Arabia, there was a mixture and gene flow between the Zagros and the Caucasus. And just to show you with a map, we see that even in Arabia, these Iranians, ancient Iranians, came in, and they're pretty decently populated. We see this gene flow. Don't get me wrong, a lot of Middle Easterners, Arabians do have Natufian DNA, but we can't forget that Iranian influence that entered into Arabia as well. This paper is actually going to prove that. This paper is titled Projecting Ancient Ancestry in Modern Day Arabians and Iranians, a key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf on human populations. So when it comes to Yemen, Saudi Arabia, even Oman and the United Arab Emirates, they of course have Levant's PPNB ancestry up to 50 and even 60%, but they also have Zagros ancestry, and Zagros is Iranian. And Iran, of course, is going to be very high among them, as well as having some European DNA, South European DNA. But we see that even in the Arabian Peninsula, where you find some of the most Natufian ancestry, even they have this Iranian influence, this Zagros Iranian influence within their ancestry. So there's definitely a mixture between two groups of people. It is clear that there was two groups of people in the Middle East, and that there was a mixture with them. Just to show you more maps, again, I would say that the Ibero-Mauritian and the Tufian ancestry represents the Afro-Asiatic, but the Caucasus hunter-gatherer and the Zagros Iranian ancestry, that represents more so the Kura-Araxes culture. And we see that in Yemen, there is definitely Caucasus hunter-gatherer influence within their population, as well as Iranian influence. In Saudi Arabia, we see Caucasus hunter-gatherer influence and Zagros Iranian influence. United Arab Emirates, Caucasus hunter-gatherer influence up to nearly 40 to 30%, and Zagros Iranian influence. United Arab Emirates, they have nearly 40 to 50% of Caucasus hunter-gatherer influence, and they also have Zagros Iranian, and of course Iran is going to have the most Caucasus hunter-gatherer and Zagros Iranian DNA. And these are just different charts that show just the different type of the genomes. And we see that when they're tested multiple times, you do basically get a split between Caucasus hunter-gatherers, Zagros Iranian, Ibero-Mauritian, and Natufian. So even the Arabians have this when they're tested multiple times. And sometimes it's even just Caucasus hunter-gatherer. But this does basically prove a great admixture event that occurred. And again, I've showed this in the past. Yemenites, they have some of the highest amount of Natufian ancestry, going up to nearly 63%, 57%, 65%, 64%, 71%. But they also have Iranian influence as well. 20% Iranian, 12% Anatolian, 3% Georgia Caucasus hunter-gatherer. And when it comes to this Yemenite population, they have Iranian DNA as well at 24%, 50% Anatolian, 2% Georgia Caucasus hunter-gatherer. This Yemenite population, they also have 21% Iranian, 13% Anatolian. This Yemenite population, 24% Iranian, 11% Anatolian. And this Yemenite population, 19% Iranian, and about 9% Anatolian. So there was gene flow with even the Yemenites, Bedouins, and Arabians, who have the highest amount of Natufian ancestry, but even they have Iranian DNA and Caucasus hunter-gatherer DNA and Anatolian DNA. Saudis, they have 21% Iranian, 9% Anatolian, 1% Georgian Caucasus hunter-gatherer. Bedouin B, 19% Iranian, 8% Anatolian, 2% Georgia Caucasus hunter-gatherer. Yemenites, 21% Iranian, 13% Anatolian, 0.8% Georgia hunter-gatherer, Caucasus hunter-gatherer. Yemenite Jews, 19% Iranian, 13% Anatolian, 4% Georgia Caucasus hunter-gatherer. So we do see basically a genetic split with Proto-Afro-Asiatic people who would have Levant Natufian ancestry and Caucasus hunter-gatherer populations that would have Anatolian, Iranian, and Caucasus hunter-gatherer DNA. Bedouin A, 41% Levant Natufian, but then they have 24% Anatolian, 17% Iranian, and 9% Georgia Caucasus hunter-gatherer. So what's interesting about this admixture that we can see in Middle Easterners from a genetic perspective is that biologists in the field of like chronology and skeletal remains and such, they could actually tell this admixture long before the introduction of genetic studies. And basically they said that there was an admixture event between people who, are so-called Negroid and Armanoid in the ancient Middle East. So let's read some of that. This is from Encyclopedia of World History, and it reads, the population of both Upper and Lower Mesopotamia in prehistoric times belonged to the brown or Mediterranean race. While this basic stock persisted in historical times, especially in the South, it became increasingly mixed. So we see that it became increasingly mixed, especially with the broad-headed Armanoid peoples from the northeast mountains, owing to its recurrent incursions of mountain tribes into the plains. So we see that Mesopotamia, it was once populated by people who were the brown or Mediterranean race. We covered in the past, that's basically dark-skinned, Negroid-looking people. And then we have the Armanoid peoples, who are typically described as being white-skinned peoples, admixed with each other in Mesopotamia. There was a mixture event. Just to re-emphasize what that Mediterranean race is, so that y'all can understand this terminology, particularly when we note once more that Mediterranean is not a synonym for white. Elliott Smith's brown or Mediterranean race being near the mark. Elliott Smith classes these Proto-Egyptians as a branch of what he calls the brown race, which is the same as Sergey's Mediterranean or Euro-African race. The term brown in this context refers to skin color and is simply a euphemism for Negro. So if you ever hear the term the brown race or the Mediterranean race or the Euro-African race, it's basically talking about Negroid looking people. And for the Armanoid, what is that? The so-called Armanoid type is defined by Hayden under the Euro-Asiatic brachycephals as Anatolian, Armenian, dark hair, tawny, white skin, medium stature, very brachycephalic, a prominent aquiline nose, which means a hooked nose, with a depressed tip and large wings is very characteristic. Scattered in Anatolia, Armenia, the ancient Hittites were typical members of this race. So looking at Armenian people and looking at depictions of the Hittites, that's basically a good example of the Armanoid phenotype. So here is another source that deals with this admixture event between Armanoid peoples and these, again, brown, your African peoples within the Middle East. So it reads, but it is possible that even in this period, the Armanoids of the north were already beginning to infiltrate into northern Sumer. So the Armanoids are coming in to northern Sumer from the north. It must be remembered that soon after the fall of the Semitic Empire of Akkad, the entire land of Sumer and Akkad was ruled for over a century by the Gutians from the north between the upper and lower Zeb rivers. And we did a video on the Gutians. The Gutians are a non-Semitic people, and they're being described as having this Armanoid phenotype. The valuable results obtained by the authors of this paper confirm that the historians had assumed in regard to the early mixture of Sumerians and the Semites at Kish, the oldest capital of Sumer and the greatest metropolis of the north, later known as Akkad. Dr. Bingston finds an increasing admixture of the round-headed Armanoid type. So we see that there was an increasing admixture of the round-headed Armanoid type that must be examined as an infiltration from Syria and the Hittite region if they are not normal variants. So we see that there was indeed a mixture with Armanoid peoples from the region of the Hittites. And again, Hittites are connected with that Armanoid phenotype, and that there was an influction, that there was basically an invasion of these people into Syria. So let's get deeper into what this Armanoid type is and what this brown Euro-African type is within the Middle East. So it says the third type, which is represented but sparingly, is extremely different. The head form is brachycephalic, in some cases extremely so. There seems, however, to be little doubt that they belong to the Armanoid race. This brachycephalic element, which forms such an important element in the population of the east lateral of the Mediterranean and also of the great land bridge stretching from India westward. This round-headed element appears to have been slowly increasing. It is on the whole commoner in Neo-Babylonia graves and in the modern population than in the earlier graves. So basically, what it's saying is that this Armanoid or round-headed uh, features of people were increasing into Mesopotamia, and they appear very common in Neo-Babylon. And Neo-Babylon, by the way, will be Kassite Babylon. The Kassite Babylonians were Indo-Iranians and Hurrians. Check out my video on the Hurrians and the Kassites. That's Neo-Babylon. And then it says it's pretty much in modern day populations, which would be Iraqi people. So they are a part of that Armanoid stock that began to increase. And again, the Armanoid stock would be a non-Semitic stock in origin, but it wasn't present in the earlier graves, as it says. It was not in the earlier graves, which would have been the Kishite people, Kish, or the Akkadians, who had the brown African phenotype. And let's get into that. So it says, it would appear then that we have at least two groups in the Near East. Two groups of people live in the Near East. One dolichocephalic and the other round-headed. And that although some members of both groups have remained unmixed, others have mingled considerably. So we do see evidence of that mixture between the dolichocephalic and the round-headed peoples. And it says that others have mingled considerably, so as to form some of the most mixed races in the world. The basal types of the brown African group and the Armanoid group. So basically, it seems to be a mixture with the brown Africans and the Armanoids, which the brown Africans represents Akkadians and other Semitic peoples. The Armanoid represents northern populations, which wouldn't have been Semitic in origin, like the Gutians, who spoke possibly a Hurrian language, or even an Indo-European language. There are, however, striking differences from the types as found at Kish. There, the dolichocephals are chiefly represented by the Euro-African variety. In the Near East, this type, although it occurs, is comparatively rare. The more common type being the brown Mediterranean variety, close akin to Elliott Smith's Proto-Egyptians. As far west as Crete, they form in earlier times the majority of the population, but to the eastwards they are on the whole dominated by the round-headed Armanoids. The history of the Near East seems to suggest that there was a gradual inflection, or a gradual infiltration, really, of the latter type, probably anterior to the Copper or Bronze Age. So you had an inflection of people, an infiltration of people, or an invasion of people, a migration of people, an expansion of people in the Copper and Bronze Age. That was Armanoid, but the original population was brown African or brown Mediterranean, which would be Semitic. So this is the book, The Egyptians and the Origins of Civilization by G. Elliot Smith, and even he says and describes this change. He says there is a considerable mass of evidence to show that there was a very close resemblance between the Proto-Egyptians and the Arabs. And by the way, Elliot Smith classifies the Proto-Egyptians as the brown race that I read earlier, which is basically dark-skinned, dark-haired, dark-eyed people. And Arabs would have been the same. But he says there is a considerable evidence, massive evidence to show that there was a very close resemblance between the Proto-Egyptians and the Arabs before either became intermingled with the Armanoid racial element. So before, in the past, Proto-Egyptians and Arabs, they looked similar before they intermingled with Armanoid peoples. So this intermingling kind of changed things phenotypically. So here's another source dealing with that. The dark-skinned South Arabian today is short and extremely round-headed, brachiocephalic, but he was no doubt originally much taller and dolichocephalic, long-headed, like the so-called Hamites of East Africa. Early pre-Christian skulls found in the Hadranaut were markedly dolichocephalic. It has been suggested that the definite change in the racial constitution of the people of the Hadranaut resulted from the invasion and interbreeding of brachiocephalic whites, such as Armanoids and Persians, or Armanoids or Persians. So basically we see that there was an admixture even in Arabia, in South Arabia specifically, with the dark-skinned South Arabians mixing with some element of people that were part of this Armanoid brachiocephalic type. Henry Field suggests that Arabia's current ethnography is the result of the mixing of two distinct basal stocks: the dolichocephalic, long-headed, dark-skinned Mediterranean/Euro African, and the brachiocephalic, round-headed, fair-skinned Armanoid. So basically, you had dark-skinned people and light-skinned people admixed with each other in the Middle East, specifically in places like Arabia. And this dark-skinned phenotype, it would have been a dolichocephalic, Euro African people, whereas this fair-skinned type was a Armanoid people. And what we see is that this, dark-skinned type likely was the more Semitic type, whereas the fair-skinned type was, like they said, Persian, which is Iranian, a non-Semitic type of people. This is from the book The Negro in the New World. And it says, it is quite conceivable that the great peninsula of Arabia was once populated as far as its natural conditions allowed by a primitive Negro stock. So again, Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula was originally more Negroid, which may have been later or partially exterminated by changing and unfavorable conditions of climate and by the aftercoming of the white man and his type. So even this book illustrates that, the original population of Arabia would have changed, one, because of climate, but two, because of, they say, the white man, but it's likely the Armanoid phenotype. This is the book The Arabs. The original inhabitants of Arabia, then, according to Sir Arthur Keith, one of the world's greatest living anthropologists, who has made a study of Arab skeletal remains, ancient and modern, were not the familiar Arabs of our own time, but a very much darker people. A proto-Negroid belt of mankind stretched across the ancient world from Africa to Malaysia, giving rise to the Hamitic peoples of Africa, to the Dravidian peoples of India, and to the intermediate dark people inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula. In the course of time, two big migrations of fair-skinned peoples came from the north. It's always going to be the north when you hear about this. It's always lighter-skinned peoples from the north coming into the Middle East. One of them, Mongoloid, to break through and transform the dark belt of mankind beyond India. The other, the Caucasoids, to drive a wedge between India and Africa. The more vile invaders overcame the dark-skinned peoples, absorbing most of them, so there's mixing, driving others southward, where my own exploration is believed to have discovered vestiges of them in a natural sanctuary beyond the great sandy ocean of Rub al Khali. So we even see that there was basically they absorbed some of them, the light skinned populations absorbed some of the dark skinned populations. That's basically admixture. And other dark skinned Middle Eastern populations would have fled southwards, going, I guess, to South Arabia. And that would make sense because you do see a lot of dark skinned South Arabians. And even Chente Diop even basically illustrates this very fact that there was mixing in the Middle East. This book says there is no better way to delimit the conditions of crossbreeding in a defined paleo environment, a crossbreeding which ultimately may have led to the formation of the recent branches of humanity. Semites, Arabs, and Jews in a different geological context. The formation of the Semitic branch occurred between the 5th and 4th millennium. There was genuine interbreeding between white and black at the beginning of the historical era. So there was mixing between white people, black people in the Middle East. In the Rabhad Museum in Saudi Arabia, one can see the reproduction of cave paintings showing the Negroid type that inhabited the Arabian Peninsula in Neolithic times. This type, who progressively crossbred with white elements, came from the northeast to give rise finally to the Arabian type. Not until the Sabaean era, 1000 BC, was this crossbreeding completed in the south. So again, basically a lot of admixture took place within places like Arabia. All Semites, Arabs and Jews, as well as the quasi-totality of Latin Americans, are mixed breeds of whites and blacks. So basically, in his mind, Semites, they're basically semi-black, semi-white. They're in between the two. Again, another book dealing with this, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, and even it says, anthropologically and culturally speaking, the Semitic world was born during proto-historic times from the mixture of white-skinned and black-skinned peoples in Western Asia, aka the Middle East. These facts, on which even Arab authors agree, prove, as will shortly become more evident, that the Arab race cannot be convinced as anything but a mixture of black and whites, a process continuing even today. So again, Semitic peoples, they're a mixture between white and black people, or Negroid, Armanoid peoples, basically dark-skinned Middle Easterners and light-skinned northern peoples from the Caucasus and Iran. Consequently, it is important to change our notions about the Semite, whether in Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, or Arabia. The Semite, insofar as he is discernible, objectively appears as the product of a Negro-white mixture. It is possible that the whites who came to crossbreed with the Negroes in that area of Western Asia, the Middle East, were distinguished by certain ethnic features such as the Hittite nose. So basically, the mixture between this Negroid element and this white element is specifically a Hittite type of people, and we've covered who the Hittites would have looked like. Again, the so-called Armanoid type is defined by Hayden under the Euro-Asiatic brachycephals as Anatolian, Armenian, dark hair, tawny white skin, medium stature, very brachycephalic, a prominent aquiline nose, means a hooked nose, with a depressed tip, a large wings, very characteristic, scattered in Anatolia, Armenia. The ancient Hittites were typical members of this race. So when he's talking about a mixture between a Negroid element and a type of people with this Hittite features, it's talking about Armanoid features, basically. And this is what Hittites look like. This is a Hittite, ancient Hittites made by them. This is how they depicted themselves. And this is an Armenian man. And again, in the flesh, when it comes to this Armanoid phenotype, it's best represented by the Armenians. And then you have the ancient representation of the Armanoid type, which is the Hittites. So this is what he's saying, that there was a mixture between a Negro element and a Hittite element, basically a Negroid element and a Armanoid element, or a Armenian type of element. So those type of peoples are mixing with each other in the Middle East, the ancient Middle East. So this statement of a Negroid or Armanoid types living in the ancient Middle East is actually true based on artwork alone. Like, you can just look at artwork and you can see that there was two ethnic groups of people living in the ancient Middle East. You can clearly see two distinct phenotypes in the Near East. So here is just various depictions of Semitic peoples. These are Akkadians right here, made from the palace of Mari. These are also Akkadians from Mari. These are Elamites, Elamite peoples, and Elam, of course, being connected to the son of Shem, Elam. You hear of Arameans right here in Syria, Bedouin Arameans made by Egyptians during the dynasty of the 20th dynasty. These are Arameans depicted by Assyrians who are being conquered. These right here are Chaldeans, and these are another Semitic people who I'll get into in the future. This is a Syrian man and a Syrian wife. So clearly you did have an element of people in the ancient Near East that was definitely dark skinned, dark brown skin, black haired, dark eyed. The ancient Middle East had various phenotypes. But here's the other Middle Eastern element that we see. This lighter skinned, Armanoid looking phenotype. As we can see, white to taunty skin. You see even with this aquiline nose, basically a curvature of the nose, a hook nose. And these features with this, with the beards and the triangular facial features and such, and are the rounder headed, such the brachycephalic, as we can see right here. So clearly we do have two ancient Middle Eastern populations, two ancient Middle Eastern peoples. But most of the Semitic peoples seem to represent this darker skinned phenotype, whereas the non-Semitic peoples, like the Hittites, who were Indo-European Anatolian people, or the Sumerians, who were in language isolate people who may have spoken a Caucasian language. This lighter skinned phenotype seems to be more associated with the non-Semitic. So even from a genetic standpoint, Natufians are described as looking Negroid, and Caucasus hunter-gatherers had alleles for light skin. I feel like that's also important. It says, it is a further surprise that the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom that Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. There is evidence that some 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, a black Negroid race inhabited Palestine. Even Sir Arthur Keith argues that they are clearly Negroid, decidedly prognathous, which means a protruding of the jaw, with wide faces, flat noses, and long, large heads. Sir Arthur Keith goes on to say that these early Palestinian blacks may have been the ancestors of the Semites or Arabs of biblical times. Other markings found on these skeletons seems to indicate that the early black Palestinians had connections with ancient Ur of the Chaldees. So basically, Natufians, they would have looked Negroid basically, and Afro-Asiatic populations come from Natufians and Ibero-Maurusians. This is a Natufian reconstruction, and clearly he is a dark brown-skinned individual with black hair, dark eyes. His hair likely would have been a bit curlier though, but that's okay. He looks like he can fit into any Bedouin or Arabian or Yemenite tribe. And now when it comes to Caucasus hunter-gatherers, they are actually the very people who had light-skinned genes. They were the first to have the light-skin alleles. So it reads, to explore further, we looked at genomes in two pigmentation genes proposed to have been strongly selected in the ancestors of modern Europeans, namely SLC45A2 and SLC24A5. Selected SNPs in the SLC45A2 and SLC24A5 genes contributes to lightening of skin and are almost fixed in modern Europeans. We found that Katos and Serbia have the ancestral version of the SLC45A2 variant, but both Caucasus hunter-gatherers have the selected version of the SLC24A5 gene, encompassed by the most commonly associated haplotype C11 found in modern populations. So Caucasus hunter-gatherers have the ancestral version of basically the light skin allele. And so likely Caucasus hunter-gatherers could have had an Armanoid phenotype. They were in the Caucasus in Georgia, and typically this phenotype is in that region. Short-headed, high skull type with fleshy features, a flat occiput, and hooked nose. Often dark-haired and light brown skinned, common in mountain regions of Asia Minor, especially Armenia and Anatolia. So that is a phenotype typical of that area. So you have your Natufians, who represent Proto-Afro-Asiatics, including Semites, and then you have your Caucasus hunter-gatherers that would represent Caucasian and Indo-European populations. Clearly, both of these people's descendants live in the Middle East, and you have two distinct peoples there. Here is the, again, distribution of Natufian ancestry, or Natufian ancestry from a modern perspective. It is among Afro-Asiatic people, as I keep reiterating, highest in the Middle East. But then you have the expansion of Caucasus hunter-gatherers, and their ancestry is also seen mainly in the northern area of Arabia, but it's also seen among Arabians as well. And again, the Natufians, they are 60% Arabian, Neolithic Arabian, 60% Neolithic North African, 60% Arabian, 21% Neolithic North African, and 6% Neolithic Almatic. All these populations would have been dark-skinned. Basically, Natufians are, in a sense, Afro-Asiatic. They're half African and half Asiatic, so even genetically they fit that mode. Not even linguistically are they the first Afro-Asiatic speakers. They are genetically Afro-Asiatic, having ancestry from both Africa and Asia. Whereas Caucasus hunter-gatherers, their genome is mainly that of the Caucasus, having no relation to Afro-Asiatics, not being the first Afro-Asiatic speaking peoples. A lot of their descendants have being peoples in Anatolia, the Southern Caucasus, and Iran, which are all non-Semitic populations. Those are either Indo-European or Caucasian speakers. So genetically speaking, populations close to Natufians are Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemenis, and South Arabians are typically the darkest Middle Easterners, and again, genetically closest to Natufians, and genetically speaking, the closest to Caucasus hunter-gatherers / Iranian ancestry are Iranian people, Armenians, and Kurds, etc. Frankly, it's mainly lighter-skinned people in the Middle East, or lighter-skinned Middle Easterners, that have this Caucasus hunter-gatherer and Zagros ancestry at its highest amount. These are the peoples who have the highest genetic amount of Caucasus hunter-gatherer and Iranian Zagros ancestry. Again, it's going to be the Iranians, it's going to be the Armenians, it's going to be the Chechens, the Ingish, the Kurds, and various other populations within the Middle East that typically are lighter skinned, have this higher amount of Caucasus hunter-gatherer and Zagros ancestry. Whereas people in the Middle East with darker skin tones, they typically have higher amounts of Natufian and Ibero-Maurutian ancestry from a genetic level. They have the highest amounts. Typically, again, the darker skinned Middle Easterners with this Ibero-Mauritian and Natufian ancestry. So I would say clearly that Proto-Semitic phenotype was a darker skin type and complexion. Again, I would say that the Proto-Semitic phenotype would have been darker in the past. But here is where genotype can trump phenotype. So keep this in mind. This is very important. Ultimately, genetically, an Afro-Asiatic person, regardless of skin tone, will have these two elements. One, haplogroup E, and two, Natufian / Ibero-Mauritian ancestry. But from a paternal perspective, haplogroup E. And obviously, they're light-skinned people with haplogroup E. This is why haplogroups are important, because this can basically trump a lot of notions that we have. And because of these two types of people that are around each other, it clearly can show that there was mixing among the two, because biologically we see basically gene flow within both populations in the genetic studies. Because you can find a person with a phenotype that is Armanoid looking, but that person can have haplogroup E. Likewise, you can find a phenotype with a person who's Negroid looking, but they have haplogroup J. So we can basically phenotypes change often when it comes to the women that you're mixing with as well. But the paternal line, it doesn't change. It remains the same, even if you are mixing with other populations of women. So that's where genotype can really trump phenotype. Ultimately, like I said, an Afro-Asiatic person would have the paternal Y chromosome haplogroup E, and that there's various phenotypes of people with haplogroup E, even though I feel like originally it would have been darker skinned in the past. And also from an autosomal perspective, our Natufian and our Ibero-Mauritian ancestry would be included in that Proto-Afro-Asiatic genome. But ultimately, what I want y'all to understand is this, that the Y DNA chromosome is key. It is the key to determining who is Afro-Asiatic or who is Kura-Araxes. Genetically speaking, haplogroup J is Kura-Araxes populations with Iranian and Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry. This is from Eupedia. The Caucasus was the birthplace of bronze metallurgy and the two great Bronze Age cultures that stemmed from it, the Maya Copiumnaya and Caucasus or Kura-Araxes cultures, expanded far and wide and reshaped the genetic landscape of Western Eurasia. South Caucasians would have belonged to haplogroups J1 and J2, later associated with the Kura-Araxes culture. So South Caucasians belong to J1 and J2, associated with the Kura-Araxes culture. And this is from Genomic History of Neolithic to Bronze Age Anatolia, Northern Levant, and Southern Caucasus. At the same time, during the second half of the 4th millennium BCE, the Kura-Araxes culture, which is generally thought to originate in the Southern Caucasus, expanded outward around 3000 through 2900 BCE, spreading westward to eastern Anatolia and the northern and southern Levant, and eastward to Iran. And when it comes to the genome, what is it? We find that mid-6th millennium populations from north/central Anatolia and the southern Caucasus lowlands were closely connected. They formed a genetic gradient cline that runs from western Anatolia to the southern Caucasus and Zagros in today's northern Iran. This cline forms after an admixture event that biologically connected these two regions circa 6500 BCE. Chalcolithic and Bronze Age populations across Anatolia also mostly descend from these genetic gradients. So we see that basically there's a mixture in the Southern Caucasus and the Zagros and Anatolia that kind of links all these peoples together, which of course is connected also with the Kura-Araxes culture. And so, again, all of this is linked to haplogroup J. We find an ancestry related to ancient Iranians that is ubiquitous today and all Middle Easterners. Previous studies showed that this ancestry was not present in the Levant during the Neolithic period, but appeared in the Bronze Age, where 50% of the local ancestry was replaced by a population carrying ancient Iranian-related ancestry. This population potentially introduced the Y chromosome haplogroup J1 into the region. So again, like I said, we see Iranian and Caucasian DNA connected to haplogroup J1 and its migration, and they even replaced the local population, which would have been Semitic, around the time of the Bronze Age. Here is the area of the Kura-Araxes culture, by the way. It's in the southern Caucasus, east of Anatolia, north of Iran. And here's again another image of the Kura-Araxes culture. Clearly, these people with Iranian DNA and Caucasian DNA and Y chromosome haplogroup J would be different from the Semites because geographically, Semites are in the Levant, and they would have had Natufian ancestry because of this, as well as Y chromosome haplogroup E. Semites were never in the Caucasus. They never originated in the Caucasus. But genetically, haplogroup E is Afro-Asiatic populations with Natufian/Ibero-Mauritian ancestry. This is from the book In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory, and it reads, most of the Afro-Asiatic speakers share the lineage defined by Yap descendant called PN2/215/M35. So most Afro-Asiatic speakers, they belong to Yap descendants, haplogroup E. And this is from the Prehistory of Language from the perspective of the Y chromosome. Bellwood, based on his interpretation of the archaeological data, suggests that Afro-Asiatic languages initially evolved in Southwest Asia and co-expanded out of this region with the spread of agriculture. Interestingly, linguistic data may also support this model of Afro-Asiatic origins using linguistic reconstruction. Maltarev in 2002 presents a Proto-Afro-Asiatic lexicon of farming technology or terminology. Based on the reconstructions, he suggests that the Natufians, agriculture, and Afro-Asiatic co-evolved in Southwest Asia. So Natufians, Afro-Asiatics, and agriculture, it's all one and the same, originating around the same time with the same people. Finally, another reason for identifying Southwest Asia as the putative homeland of Afro-Asiatic languages is the Y chromosome data as presented below in section 4 and 5. And basically, it's going to talk about the Natufians having haplogroup E. Such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. Again, Natufians and Levantine farmers, the first peoples who are going to have the first Proto-Afro-Asiatic farming lexicon, they are going to have E markers. The identification of Proto-Afro-Sans as Natufians and post-Natufians seems to satisfy all the 4 criteria. Besides the farming lexicon, there are sets of reconstructed Proto-Afro-Sans terms pointing to incipient animal breeding, a wide variety of dwellings and settlement types, a territory characterized by both desert and steep forest type of terrain and drying riverbeds, as well as deep permanent streams, a vegetation typical of such terrain, and the animals whose bones have been found at the Natufian and early Neolithic post-Natufian sites. Interestingly, there is large number of common Afro-Sans terms denoting flocked Golok animals, usually inhabiting steep and semi-deserts. Finally, the Levant appears to be an attested region from where populations began to spread starting in the early Neolithic, covering not only wide tracts of southwestern Asia, but also the adjacent parts of the Mediterranean, and Africa. So the Natufians and the Levant region is the birthplace of Afro-Asiatic languages, the Proto-Afro-Asiatic tongue, as well as agriculture and pastoralism and all these important elements to Afro-Asiatic culture and even to Semitic culture. And again, these people would have Y chromosome haplogroup E, a result that finds some support from Y chromosome analysis, which shows that the Natufians and successor Levantine Neolithic populations carried haplogroup E. So the Natufians and the successor Levantine populations, which means the descendants, carried haplogroup E. Again, the area of Natufian culture overlaps perfectly with the area of the first Proto-Semites because Proto-Semites descend from Natufians. And again, Semites, like I said, they're going to expand from the Levant into Mesopotamia, which goes to show you that Semites aren't Kura-Araxes people. They have nothing to do with them, nothing to do with the Caucasus, nothing to do with Iran, where haplogroup J will expand from because Semites are from the Levant and they descend from the Natufians. So, summary. Afro-Asiatic Semitic populations were likely darker in the past, but populations from the Kura-Araxes culture migrated into the Middle East and mixing occurred between both groups. Because there was mixing, we can't say with 100% certainty, or really we can't tell with 100% certainty phenotypically who descends from who when it comes to the early Proto-Semitic populations. This is why genetics is very important, because people with haplogroup E can genetically look like really anybody, to be honest, because it's a Y chromosome. It's passed down from father to son. But with that being said, genetically, Afro-Asiatic populations typically have haplogroup E and Natufian/Ibero-Maurusian ancestry, whereas Kura-Araxes populations typically have haplogroup J and Zagros-Iranian/Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry. It was people with this ancestry, haplogroup J, Zagros, Iranian, Caucasian DNA, that adopted the Semitic language from people with haplogroup E and Natufian/Ibero-Maurusian ancestry. Haplogroup J1 is not a Semitic haplogroup in origin. However, genetically, we cannot call this haplogroup Semitic because Semitic people mainly have the FGC11 lineage of this haplogroup in those areas. As Arabic society is mainly based on a unique cluster of J1 haplogroup FGC11, it is wrong to call all people with J1 as Semitic. In this sense, we cannot attribute haplogroup J1 to Semitic origin. So again, we cannot attribute haplogroup J1 to Semitic origin. Haplogroup J1 is not Semitic in origin. In fact, it is apparent that there are various clusters of J1 among Caucasian, European, and South/Central Asian people. Especially in Caucasia, J1 seems in high or medium amounts among various ethnic groups, such as, I'm going to name some of them, not all of them, but Luzguzians, Avars, Durgians, Sarsians, Chechenians, I mentioned the Chechenians in the past, check out my video, as well as Azerbaijani Turks and others. All these people speak various languages which are bound up with Northeast Caucasian languages, Northwest Caucasian languages, and Turkic languages. And European people having J1 also speak Indo-European languages rather than Semitic languages. So most of haplogroup J1 is really non-Semitic speakers. Most of J1 people have a non-Semitic origin and don't speak Semitic languages. They either speak Caucasian languages or Indo-European languages. And only really one branch of J speaks Semitic languages. Blue bar means J1-FGC11, which is a unique lineage among Arabs. On the other hand, the other lineages would seem among Europeans, Caucasians, and Turks rather than Arabs. This means J1 haplogroup isn't of Semitic origin. So just to show you what the paper is talking about, Haplogroup J1 only has one branch that's really seen in the Middle East and that's really seen among Semitic people, and that's P58, also known as FGC11. This one is only in the Middle East. It's only one branch of J, one single branch of J out of various other branches of J that's seen in the Middle East. But other branches of J are far more diverse among non-Semitic, non-Middle Eastern people. You see far more branches of J1, and even J2 among Indo-Europeans and Caucasians and Central Asians compared to this single branch of J that's seen among Semitic speakers. This goes to show you that this one branch of J was only one group that came into the Middle East, possibly the Hurrians as being the main group of Caucasian peoples to come in. But whoever they were, it was a group of non-Semitic people that came in and adopted the Semitic tongue from haplogroup E. Semitic languages such as Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and Amharic are characterized under the Afro-Asiatic language family. This means that Arabic and Hebrew languages derive from the same language, with Berber, Cushitic, Egyptian, Amharic, and Almatic languages of Afro-Asiatic language family in North Africa. Today we see that the most of Afro-Asiatic people are of E1b1b haplogroup, especially the lineages of V12, V32, M81, and we see a great variety of E1b lineages among both Semitic and Afro-Asiatic people, whereas only FGC11 lineage of J1 is present among Afro-Asiatic Semitic people, and it is also impossible to see J1 haplogroup among several Afro-Asiatic people such as the Amazigh or the Berbers, etc. According to the theory, Afro-Asiatic languages spread to Asia via E1b haplogroup, not J1 haplogroup. It is historically known that a ruling elite class of Afro-Asiatic people, Akkadians, Assyrians, etc., also invaded the north of Mesopotamia and brought their Afro-Asiatic languages to the central and northern parts of Mesopotamia during the period of the Akkadians and Babylonians. Elite dominance model of E1b1 might be supposed for Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. In this sense, it might be theorized that Sumerian was the main language of the ancient Mesopotamians before Afro-Asiatic E1b overwhelmed Mesopotamia, elite dominance model. So again, the typical Afro-Asiatic person, typical Afro-Asiatic populations, they have Y DNA chromosome, haplogroup E, and Natufian and Ibero-Mauritian ancestry. Phenotypically, they're typically brown skinned, all right, although skin tones do vary. When it comes to the Kura-Araxes Hurrians, they typically have Y chromosome haplogroup J. They also typically have Caucasus hunter-gatherer, as well as Iranian ancestry, which is distributed evenly among Indo-Europeans and Caucasians, as well as, they typically have this lighter-skinned Armenian or Iranian phenotype, but J1 can be seen among dark-skinned peoples as well. So conclusion though, main conclusion. Natufians equal Proto-Afro-Asiatic populations, which equal haplogroup E. Zagros/Caucasus equal Kura-Araxes populations equal haplogroup J. And this is where we end admixture between Afro-Asiatic populations and Kura-Araxes populations. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe, share the video, click the bell, leave a comment for any questions you might have, and follow my social media platforms that you are about to see. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.